I'm going to present the evidence that ultraviolet B irradiance and vitamin D reduce the risk of cancer. I have funding from a number of organizations, which I'm very thankful for. So I'm going to discuss today how vitamin D, the mechanisms that vitamin D reduces the risk of cancer, the types of evidence for benefits with findings from ecological studies to observational studies. Joan has already talked about the randomized controlled trial. Prostate cancer, I'll discuss that in a bit of detail because that's a little contentious. I'll then discuss Hill's criteria for causality in a biological system, the general benefits of increasing 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels, and mention my project with John Cannell's Vitamin D Council on 100 vitamin D sensitive health conditions. So there are a number of mechanisms whereby vitamin D may reduce the risk of cancer, and I think you've heard of many of these today, so we don't really have to go over these right now. There are four types of basic types of epidemiological studies that are used to identify and quantify links between risk-modifying factors and disease. The first three of these are called observational studies. You have the nested case control studies, where a population to follow for years after blood draw, and you look for cases in that cohort and then match them with controls. Unfortunately, the accuracy of this approach seems to decrease with time since the blood draw because vitamin D levels can change with time. There are case control studies where you look at draw the blood at time of diagnosis. Cross-sectional studies where you survey a large population, sort of go throughout the population and just look at people, find out their condition and their vitamin D levels, for example. And then ecological studies in which populations are defined geographically, and you can average both disease outcome and risk-modifying factors by region of study. The first ecological study, or first epidemiological study hypothesizing that solar ultraviolet B radiation through production of vitamin D reduced the risk of cancer was an ecological study published in 1980 by the brothers Cedric and Frank Garland. They actually were beginning graduate students at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in 1974, and they looked at the new map of colon cancer mortality rates in the United States, which only had 5 different scales at that time. And the only cancer that leaped out of them and said there may be a sunshine effect was colon cancer. And they had just driven from San Diego to Baltimore, and they knew it was very sunny in the Southern California and Arizona and New Mexico, and not very sunny in Baltimore. And they knew that one of the important physiological effects of sunlight was vitamin D production, so they just hypothesized that sunlight through production of vitamin D reduced the risk of cancer. It took them 6 years to get that paper published because the mainstream journals just didn't want to handle it. It was finally a British journal, the International Journal of Epidemiology, that finally published it in 1980. So hats off to the British. Here is a more recent version of the map they looked at. This now has 10 different color scales. Dark red is high risk, high mortality rate, up to 30 deaths per 100,000 per year. Dark blue is low, down as low as 9 deaths per 100,000 per year. Overlaid are contours of annual solar radiation, and you can see at the lowest are up in the New York State area, the highest are in the New Mexico area. And there's a rough correspondence between annual solar radiation and mortality rate, an inverse correlation. They also identified breast cancer as UVB vitamin D sensitive in 1989-1990. You see the pattern is very similar, although the western states are somewhat different. They also identified ovarian cancer around 1992 as UVB sensitive, vitamin D sensitive. Again, that's similar, a little bit of difference in the upper states. Now, look at gastric cancer. That's also similar to the others, although along the border with Mexico, there are elevated gastric cancer rates, and that's because we had a lot of Mexicans and Central Americans living along the border, and it turns out that they have a much higher infection rate of H. pylori there, and bring it up to California and Arizona, New Mexico. So that has to be factored into the analysis. And if you look, there are other hot spots here and there. Here's corpus uteri or endometrial cancer. Again, it's similar to the others. So so in 1999, when these papers were, the new atlas was published, I looked at them, and I saw the great similarity between many types of cancer. And at first, I was a little naive, and I thought, well, maybe I'd just been studying diet and Alzheimer's disease, diet and prostate cancer, diet and colon cancer, diet and heart disease, and I thought I could do an ecological study on cancer in the United States. Well, it didn't take more than about a week to realize that Americans pretty much eat the same food throughout the entire country. We eat at McDonald's and shop at Safeway and get the same diet. So then I had to go back to the paper by the Garland brothers and proceed from there. And I worked for NASA at the time, and actually got to fly around the world and measure ozone and aerosols using a laser system. And I was aware of the NASA total ozone mapping spectrometer instrument that had measured surface solar UVB in the United States for July 1992. And what you see here is that the highest rates, where the yellow and the lavender are, is in the southwest. The lowest dose is in the northeast, up in Maine. And it turns out that there are two primary reasons for that, or maybe three reasons. One is that the surface elevation in the west is somewhat higher than in the east, so there's less atmosphere to scatter the UVB. The second is that prevailing westerly winds went across the Rocky Mountains, and in doing so, they push the tropopause higher, make the stratospheric ozone layer thinner, and so you have less absorption of UVB in the west, especially in the southwest. And third thing, you have more clouds and aerosols in the northeast. So these all conspire to give an asymmetrical UVB pattern, which is very, very useful, because one of the criticisms of the ecological approach is that it often just uses latitude as the index of UVB and vitamin D. But here is an asymmetrical pattern which works for cancer in the United States. And the IRC conveniently forgot to mention this paper when they did their review of vitamin D and cancer, and I took them to task for that in a rebuttal in 2009. So one can take pictures like this, which have about 500 state economic areas, and one can digitize this map and then do correlations between the UVB and the cancer mortality rates. And I published this one in 2002, which is for breast cancer, and you see it has one slope at low levels and then flattens out above about 7 kilojoules per meter squared. For colon cancer, it seems to keep going, doesn't flatten out quite as much. Ovarian cancer is similar. Corpus uteri cancer, similar. Gastric cancer. Now, I've cut off gastric cancer at 7.5 kilojoules per square meter, as opposed to going out to 10 for these, because you have the high rates in the sunny areas, which is an artifact of having the people infected with H. pylori living there. So after the first publication, the head of epidemiology at the American Cancer Society, Michael Toon, said, well, that's interesting, but you haven't included the other cancer risk modifying factors. So I put in smoking, alcohol consumption, Hispanic heritage, because white Americans include Hispanic as well as non-Hispanic, urban residents, and poverty. Redid the analysis and found that the UVB effect stayed pretty much the same as I found in the first case. In other words, all the confounding factors seem to sort of be randomly distributed about the UVB. But we found that the results for alcohol, Hispanic heritage, and smoking agreed with the literature for which cancers were affected by these. One journal, now I submitted this, had to submit this to 10 journals to get it published, because the mainstream journals, again, didn't want to touch it. Mayo Clinic Proceedings came close to accepting it, but they said, look, you're not a trained epidemiologist, being a physicist, you're not a trained statistician, get one of each on your team and we'll reconsider it. So I got Cedric Garland on as a trained epidemiologist. I hired a statistician from Toronto, redid the analysis, sent it back to Mayo Clinic Proceedings. They said, I'm sorry, we still cannot accept it. But they were just chicken. They just didn't want to deal with it. So finally, it was accepted by Jörg Reichroth, who organizes the vitamin D conferences like the one I'm going to in Hamburg in a couple of days. He accepted it as a conference proceedings paper in 2006, published in Anti-Cancer Research, now has over 100 citations, so it's well accepted, but was not accepted by mainstream journals. In a meeting with the World Health Organization in Munich in 2005, I showed my ecological findings to the dermatologists, and they said, well, just because somebody lives where it's sunny doesn't mean they go out in the sun. I mean, certainly that's the case in the Middle East, India, and so on. And so I got to thinking, well, maybe there's a personal index of UVB irradiance that can be used to show that UV does reduce the risk of cancer. And I thought, okay, if you develop non-melanoma skin cancer, that's probably an index of total UVB irradiance. Melanoma is more to sunburning, and that's not a good index. Turns out for Spain, they had a 15-year record of cancer mortality data for the 48 or 49 continental provinces, including an index for non-melanoma skin cancer. So I use that as the index of UVB irradiance. I use latitude and I use lung cancer as the index of smoking. And I show that 17 types of cancer were inversely correlated with skin cancer, but after putting in lung cancer and latitude, 14 were still found to be good, well correlated with one or another index of UVB, or vitamin D. In my opinion, the fear of solar UVB spread by well-meaning organizations reduces overall health. Moderate sunlight exposure with as much body surface area exposed as possible when the sun elevation is above 45 degrees is nature's way of obtaining vitamin D. The dermatologists say if your shadow is longer than you are, it's okay to go in the sun. We say if your shadow is shorter than you are, that's the time to go in the sun and make vitamin D. But don't stay so long that you get red or burned. Now, there have been a lot of studies trying to follow the ecological studies to find out whether they can say that yes or no, vitamin D does affect the risk of cancer. A lot of these are observational studies looking at serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D and cancer incidence. Well, it turns out from the ecological studies, it appears that vitamin D is more associated with cancer mortality rate than cancer incidence. Here, for example, is another ecological study by Bosco and Shimura in the United States. They used southern United States and northern United States, divided in two regions, left out the middle, and just looked at latitude. Well, they looked at something, annual sunlight exposure. And what I've plotted, graphed here, or tabulated here, is the relative risk for mortality versus the relative risk for incidence. And a high number means that they're comparing low versus high UVB. So high number means the beneficial effect. And what you see is that for these cancers, is generally they found a stronger effect for mortality than they did for incidence. What I like to say is that there are many cancer risk modifying factors that affect cancer initiation. Vitamin D is only one of these factors. However, there are a few natural ways the body fights cancer once it starts to progress. Vitamin D is one of this. For example, it reduces angiogenesis and inhibits metastasis. Therefore, you might expect the vitamin D effect to be stronger for mortality rate than for incidence rate. There are a number of other ecological studies. There's France, there's China, got the United States, there's Australia. There's also the supporting data from dietary intake, serum levels, and so on. From all the results, I put together this list of 17 cancers for which I think the evidence that vitamin D reduces the risk is moderate to strong. This is the gastrointestinal cancers: colon, esophageal, gallbladder, gastric, pancreatic, and rectal. Urinary is bladder, kidney, and prostate. Females, breast, endometrial, ovarian, and vulvar. Blood, you've got Hodgkin's, non-Hodgkin's, and then you've got miscellaneous lung and melanoma. There are some others like brain and leukemia, which is a little more marginal. These are the 13 cancers that have support from oral intake. And so it's most of the ones that were on the first list, with the addition of cervical cancer and oral pharyngeal cancer. But see, one of the problems is that when you get to a rare cancer, it's so difficult to study because you need a large number of people, and if you have a cohort study or something, it's just hard to get enough in that cohort to really do the good statistics. So the reason ecological studies are powerful are several. First of all, cancers generally take 15 to 40 years to progress from initiation to detection or death. In fact, cancer even the roots of cancer start in utero. If you start a study at the age of 40 or 50, you don't see the in utero effect. There was, I don't know if you're aware of the famous paper by Bruce Armstrong and Richard Dahl in 1975. They looked at dietary links to cancer in about 35 countries and showed that almost all cancers, certainly cancers common in Western countries, were highly correlated with total fat, especially animal fat, in the national diet. For about 3 decades, that was pointed to as an example of the ecological fallacy, because cohort studies such as at Harvard could not confirm that animal fat or meat or anything like that was a risk factor for breast cancer. Finally, it dawned on them, with a little nudging from people like T. Colin Campbell, who's now a vegan after being raised on a dairy farm, that maybe the effect of diet was early in life. And it turns out that the more animal products in a person's diet early in life for a woman, the earlier she reaches sexual maturity and the more estrogen she produces. And lifetime estrogen is a big risk factor for breast cancer. And so the dietary impact on breast cancer certainly appeared much earlier in life than could be seen in a study enrolling people after the age of 35 or so. And Harvard finally was able to confirm that younger people did have an effect from animal products. So the ecological studies integrate the effects of solar UVB and other factors over many years. Large numbers of cancer cases are included. Other risk-modifying factors can be readily included in the study. The data are readily available, saving billions of dollars, pounds, or euros, as well as many years of research. Now, they're nested case control studies of breast and colorectal cancer versus serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D. These are useful in looking at serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D level and cancer incidence rates for these 2 cancers. What I've shown is that there is a problem if you go too long in the analysis, in the follow-up. For colorectal cancer, I've plotted here in a paper that's published that if you look at the number of follow-up years and you look at the middle line is the regression to the relative risk. The dashed and dotted lines are the 95% confidence intervals. There are 2 or 3 outliers, but if you look at most of the studies, even out to 14 years, you find that the 95% confidence interval is less than 1. So statistically significant except in 1 or 2 studies. And you notice that the best risk reduction is for the case control study, right at time equals 0. For breast cancer, after 3 years, nobody has found a statistically significant inverse correlation between serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D and breast cancer incidence. When the Institute of Medicine put together, it was directed by the Food and Drug Administration and NIH to look at set new guidelines for vitamin D. They were expressly told, don't include case control studies, don't include any study in which UV is a source of vitamin D. Only use nested case control studies and randomized controlled trials. Essentially, they hamstrung the committee on purpose. Now, nonetheless, you can use these studies to look at dose-response relationships. And I do a poor man's version of a meta-analysis. I take the published data, I plot the odds ratio as a function of the median for each quartile or quantile. I then adjust the odds ratio so that all the points sort of line up along the same regression line. And from this, for example, for colorectal cancer, find that if one went from 54 nanomoles per liter to 105 nanomoles per liter, there'd be a 30% reduction in colorectal cancer incidence. Of course, if you take people who start at 10 or 20 and increase by 20 or 30 nanomoles, you're going to get a greater increase, greater reduction. For breast cancer, it's a very similar effect. There's more interest now in vitamin D and survival. Here's an example from a Harvard study. They found that those who had 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels, an average of 100 nanomoles per liter at time of diagnosis had about half the mortality rate over, I don't know how many years, as those with an average of about 40 nanomoles per liter. There have been a number of studies for breast. You've got a 50% difference in mortality rate over 12 years, I think, or in Toronto. The colorectal, lung cancer, 25% difference for non-small cell lung cancer. Newton Bishop, the 20% increase relapse-free survival. Multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's B-cell lymphoma, and prostate cancer, better prognosis in Norway. So no matter that there's only one good randomized controlled trial, the observational evidence does show that people who have more vitamin D at time of diagnosis do have a much better prognosis. Now, prostate cancer is a funny one. There are studies showing that UV exposure early in life and sufficient UVB exposure to cause non-melanoma skin cancer throughout life are inversely correlated with prostate cancer incidence. On the other hand, observational studies of serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D for follow-up periods up to 28 years have not been, in general, found correlated with prostate cancer incidence. Vitamin D seems to affect the risk of prostate cancer early in life and may protect against metastasis. And I'll get to that Tuolhima study before we're over here. If you look at the map for prostate cancer and compare it with colon cancer, you see that in prostate cancer, the high rates are in the northwest, the lowest rates are in the southeast. That's the inverse of what we have for colon cancer, or it's a mirror image of what you have for colon cancer. That has bugged me for about 10 years. I mean, I've been trying to look at it and trying to figure out. I've gone through various hypotheses, such as maybe there's a viral risk factor that affects men early in life, and if they have low vitamin D in the winter, that can spread to a prostate infection, which I guess later in life. Tim Oliver seems to think that may be happening. I'm not so sure. But what I found about a year ago, or 2 years ago now, I found the map of greatest ancestry by county in the United States and saw many features that were correlated between the two maps. In the upper part of the country where it's blue, you have a lot of people with German or British ancestry. Down in the southwest, you have a lot of people with Hispanic ancestry. In the northeast, you've got Russians, you've got Finns, you've got Italians, you've got Irish. And I saw a high correlation between ethnic background and prostate cancer mortality rate. So I did also in the United States, the African Americans, they're not on this map, this is only white Americans, which includes Hispanics. The African Americans have about twice the prostate cancer mortality rate, or even higher than white Americans. So I hypothesized that perhaps the same gene that's a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and coronary heart disease, apolipoprotein E epsilon 4, might be a risk factor for prostate cancer. And I did an ecological study involving 122 countries using that, dietary supply values, and per capita gross domestic product. In the full data set, per capita GDP, lack of cereal consumption, milk protein, and APOA epsilon 4 were significantly correlated with incidence, explaining 60% of the variance. In the smaller subset, excluding Africa, you got similar results. And the interpretation is that cholesterol has been identified as an important risk factor for prostate cancer. The APOE epsilon 4 allele, which is common in hunter-gatherer populations, is Africans, Inuit, Polynesians, Melanesians, any who live on hunting and gathering rather than agricultural production, they have a much higher prevalence. The Bushmen up to 45%, Africans 30-35%, Inuits 30%, whereas if you get down to Kuwait and Thailand, it's maybe 8%. So it's producing cholesterol in order to try to store all excess food as fat, and producing more insulin, so it takes the cholesterol into the cells. There's also a recent study just came out about 2 weeks ago from Washington State showing that fish consumption was a risk factor for high-grade aggressive prostate cancer. And I looked in literature and found there are studies showing that DHA from fish oil increases low-density lipoprotein cholesterol and reduces triglycerides. And so cholesterol is a risk factor for prostate cancer. Turns out triglycerides are associated with reduced risk of prostate cancer. So it looked like fish oil was producing lipids in the blood that were increasing risk of prostate cancer. Now, if you look at the Tuolhima study that was been talked about, that was done in Nordic countries. Turns out most of the effect was found in Norway. About 58 or so of the 68 cases at the higher level of vitamin D were from Norway. Norway has about the highest fish consumption in the world, other than maybe Japan. They have, on average, 6 or 7 grams of fish oil per day in the national diet. Finland and Sweden only had about 3 grams of fish oil per day. Fish is a good source of vitamin D. So it looks as if fish consumption was a confounding factor. Now, they did talk about, at that time, the understanding was that fish reduced the risk of prostate cancer. But if you take this new evidence and think about it, and then the fact that they had a 17-year observational period, who knows whether the serum level at 17 years corresponded to the level throughout the study. So unfortunately, well, when I was in atmospheric studies, the people who didn't like carbon dioxide, didn't want to control carbon dioxide, and were looking at all of the outlier data and saying that's why we shouldn't control coal combustion, we call those people confusionists. And I think that people who point to these U-shaped curves are the modern-day confusionists in the vitamin D story. Anyway, there is a recent study from Harvard showing that vitamin D is inversely correlated with high-grade prostate cancer or mortality rate. So there is a benefit for vitamin D for prostate cancer. It does reduce metastasis. It does reduce angiogenesis. It just appears in my book that it doesn't have any impact between initiation and when you get to metastasis after about 40 years. They're sort of simmering for many, many years. Now, the question is, do UVB and vitamin D satisfy the criteria for causality for cancer? The highly regarded British statistician and epidemiologist A. Bradford Hill in 1965 laid down the criteria for causality in a biological system at his presidential address to the British Medical Society. The important criteria include strength of association, consistency, biological gradient, plausibility, coherence, experimental verification, and analogy. Randomized controlled trial is but one of the criteria that can be used in a system like this. Vitamin D is not a drug. Vitamin D is a natural substance from sunlight with which we will live for years. Therefore, there's plenty of observational data that can be used and have been used. And to me, the idea that we have to wait for randomized controlled trials to say that, yes, vitamin D does do something is a delay tactic based on not wanting vitamin D either to enhance the profits of the drug industry or the specialists or to protect the retirement systems of the countries. But it's not based on science. My answer is yes. For over a dozen types of cancer, the criteria are satisfied, and I published this in a paper in 2009. So in conclusion, the hypothesis, the UVB vitamin D cancer hypothesis generally satisfies the criteria for causality in a number of cancers. It takes levels, I would say, actually between 100 and 150 nanomoles per liter to provide reasonable protection against many types of cancer. As of May 10th of this year, there are 2,413 papers with vitamin D and cancer in the title or abstract listed at pubmed.gov. Now, let me just, if I've got another couple of minutes here, go to a couple other topics. One is I have done a number of studies on what would happen if the population serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D level were raised from 54, which seems to be the worldwide average, to 105 nanomoles per liter, which is the minimum you can say would be beneficial based on dose-response relationships. Take the reduction factor, look at the reduced number of deaths, and this is for Europe. Okay, so what I find is that for Europe, if you have a total of 9.49 million deaths per year, you could reduce 1.97 million of those, or about 21% of the cancer, the deaths could be considered premature based on low vitamin D levels. Now, again, one of my cheap or home-done graphical meta-analyses shows from looking at 4 or 5 studies of all-cause mortality rate versus 25-hydroxyvitamin D that there would be a 26% reduction in going from 54 to 105 nanomoles per liter. This is based on people over age 45 at time of enrollment. Many people don't get to age 45, so the 21% I have is a reasonable agreement with this result. And I do have a paper coming out in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition in July, which is a worldwide analysis like this, what would happen in every continent. It turns out that in Africa they have an average life expectancy of 45 years, in Europe more like 75 years. Nonetheless, in every country, every continent, you get about a 2-year life extension by raising the serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels to that amount. You would have direct and indirect costs for healthcare may drop by 10%, and this is the most cost-effective way to reduce disease rates. In the United States, a year's supply of vitamin D at 3,000 or 4,000 IU per day costs about $10, about 7 pounds. You can't beat that. Now, I have a project. The final thing I want to talk about is I have a project with John Cannell, the Vitamin D Council, to produce documents, scientific documents, and patient-friendly documents on what is known about the evidence that ultraviolet radiation and vitamin D reduce the risk of these diseases, or in some cases, does actually increase the risk. I've been spent over a year on this. It's been pretty much full-time the last 2 or 3 months. These have gone online today.
I ask you which of the major diseases or conditions you think actually reduce the vitamin D?
Are reduced by vitamin D?
The diseases reduce the vitamin D, yes. Like say, you know, with drugs, perhaps tamoxifen, if you're on breast cancer, and tamoxifen, the vitamin D will be reduced. What other examples are there?
Well, it's more the treatment. It's more the drugs that are used for treating, like glucocorticoids. It's also like the people get melanoma or skin cancer, they think they better stay out of the sun.
Right.
I forget, there are some others. There's MRSA, the bacteria that eat the skin. Turns out that's more common in summer, which appears that the UV impairs the surface immune function, and so it's less able to fight the bacteria.
Thank you. If I could add something to that, at the conference that we were at in Madrid, there were about 12 or 15 drugs in which they worked well with vitamin D, or vitamin D enhanced their operation. And there was only one that was antagonistic, and I didn't make a note of it at the time. No, it was, I think it was live data from case studies. And sorry?
It's called colors. It's something on the drug.
Yeah. It's called colors. And I will go back to the organizer of that conference, who hasn't published papers online yet, and see if we can get that information. And Carol, I think you mentioned something that in the meeting in Germany a few days later, after that, after our April meeting, there was a pharmacist who spoke.
There were quite a number of drugs that that reduce the absorption of vitamin D, and I do not have that list. We will post it as soon as we get it. My apologies, even if, well, I'm not apologizing for bringing it up. I want you as cancer people to be aware and start paying attention to that. I just don't have the detail today.
Apparently, medications for reducing seizures, they interfere with vitamin D metabolism, so sodium valproate and phenytoin, apparently.